All right. Well, welcome. Welcome. Good to see everybody. Thank you for coming back. I think that's a good thing for you. You never know after the first week of a marriage class whether you come back or whether you come back together. Most of you are. So that's good. That's good. All right. So we're going to get started here just for a few moments. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to do another icebreakers because I value relationships and I value you meeting other people. And so in just a moment, we're going to do like we did last week, break up, meet 2 or 3 folks that you have not yet met, and I'll have you share something here in a moment that I'll explain. But let's pray first. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the gift of this evening and for what you have in store for us. I pray that tonight would be worthwhile. In the middle of the week, we can all be thinking of the many other things that we could be doing, probably need to be doing, things that are piling up right now as we speak, kids that had to figure out their own feeding tonight, all of that stuff. But we are here, and we pray that it will be worthwhile. So may your spirit be with us. May it lead and guide the conversations that we have in this place, and may we hear something that would help shape our marriages to better reflect who you've called and created us to be. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so here's the deal. We're going to do our icebreaker here and get to meet some folks. And the thing I want you to share is this. What is a funny, embarrassing moment in your marriage? Okay, now, understand you probably ought not to share something about your spouse without their permission, because that could very quickly move into the conflict part of what we're trying to manage in this class. But I want you to think about what is a funny, embarrassing moment in your marriage. I'm going to have my wife share ours.
Hi, guys. So, on our honeymoon, I can't believe I'm telling you this story.
It's funny.
It's hilarious, but I can't believe I'm telling it in public.
Yeah, well, it's out there now. It's on the web. It's on the web right now.
All right, so here we go. So, on our honeymoon, we did a very unique type of honeymoon. I'm an amusement park junkie. I love going to amusement parks, and so Jeff does not. And so we literally went in Ohio to every amusement park that we could find. We were down in Cincinnati, and we went to this water park, and we went down a water slide, and we were in a tube. Well, his girth, as he calls it, and me, I was 70 pounds lighter then, but physics was not in my favor. So his girth threw me off the raft. Well, I hit the slide with my tailbone, and when I was trying to get up out of the water, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in so much pain. How am I going to do this? Well, I'm like doing it very trying not to be hurt. And he's back there behind me, busting out laughing. And I'm like, what in the world? I'm hurt and you're laughing? What is so funny? And he goes, you just burnt a hole in your crack of your bathing suit. And obviously, can't do anything about that. So I had a fun time the rest of the night.
Oh, so awesome. She hit that slide and just skidded down. Sparks must have flown. It did. Oh, my girth won out that one. All right, so let's do this. Let's break up. Introduce yourself to someone you don't know and share with them something funny, embarrassing about your marriage, something that has happened to you all. All right, ready, go. And if you don't have a folder and need one, come up and grab one from me at some point. every other OCD person in here is going to plug in as well. About 3 or 4 more minutes. All right, if we can wrap it up here. I may need a little bit more sound. All right. Well, let's bring it back here together. There is nothing that brings a group closer than being able to laugh at each other. I think that's good. You know, and that's important. Laughter is important. I think, again, one of the things you'll hear from me is that too often we take our lives and our marriages way too seriously. Moments that we can laugh at from time to time is extremely healthy for us, I think, in our marriages. Well, tonight I want to take a look at the postures of our marriage, and I'm going to start in a rather unique way. Now, if you've been here at Bridgeway for a while, you've heard me say this. If you've not, this may be the first time, and probably unexpectedly, is that one of my favorite things in the world, and I know this seems weird coming from me with the girth and the football player background and all of that, is I love dance. I just love dance. Like, I love to watch dance. I wish I could do it. This is not the kind of body that does it. So I have to stand and watch skinny people do it and secretly loathe them. This is actually a famous dance that no, I'm just joking. That's not me at all. I don't make pants like that for me. But I love dance, and I love the different kinds of dances. I'm a big fan of like Dancing with the Stars, those types of shows. But I also like dance as an image for relationships. So if you've been through Hopetimism 101, you've heard me say that I believe that we live in this sort of perpetual dance with God. And one of the things that I love when I do weddings is I love watching little girls dance with their daddies. And you know how that happens, right? The little child steps up on daddy's shoes, right? And daddy dances and sort of carries her along. And I kind of see that as our relationship with God, that we sort of crawl up on daddy's shoes. And through his spirit and the melody that he plays in this world, we sort of follow his movements in this world. And I can always tell when I'm starting to move towards disobedience, because my dancing does not as smooth, and I try to step off of his shoes and dance my own jig, right? And I kind of mess things up. But I like this idea of dancing as a relationship, because there's something beautiful in it. There's something unique, something dynamic in it. And I think for our relationships as well, in our marriages, dancing becomes a really good metaphor. But it's the kind of dance that you choose that I think is really important. So I've got two different dances that we're going to look at tonight. One is called the Paso Doble, and the other one is the Rumba, okay? So we're going to look at both these dances. Now, I want you to watch both dances. Then we're going to compare the dances, okay? And I want you to tell me what you're seeing in these dances. So the first is the Paso Doble. Check this out. All right, that's the Paso Doble, okay? Now, Jason Joyner has volunteered to reenact that whole thing, right? You didn't know that about Jason. Just saying. Okay, so that was Paso Doble, all right? So keep that in mind, what you just saw, what you witnessed. Now, this is the Rumba.
Rusted brandy in a diamond glass. Everything is made from dreams. Time is made from honey, slow and sweet. Only the fools know what it means. Temptation. Temptation. Temptation, I can't resist. Well, I know that he's made of smoke, but I've lost my way. He knows that I am broke, but temptation. Ooh, temptation. Temptation. I can't resist temptation.
All right. So that was the rumba, okay? So you saw two very different dances, Paso Doble and the rumba. Talk to me about what you saw in the movements. What did you notice about the Paso Doble? What did you notice about the movements in that?
What I noticed between the two of them, on the first one, they seemed to dance more separately.
Okay.
And then the second one, they were much more together.
Okay, good. Good observation, Dave. Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Debbie. Very good. Yeah, good. Yeah, Nate.
The first one, some of their actions towards each other seemed almost aggressive.
Ah. Okay, yeah.
She placed her hands on him, he moved them right away, or like they did that specific thing like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. Yeah. What else did you catch? What else? Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, Jenny. Okay. Good, 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 good. All right, well, let's talk about these dances. Why on earth would I start tonight talking about these dances? Okay, so the first is, let's talk a little bit about the Paso Doble, okay? The Paso Doble is a dance that is based upon the idea of a matador, and the woman in the Paso Doble either plays the part of the cape itself for the matador or the bull, depending on where it's being done and in what context that's being done. But you get this sense from the Paso Doble that the movements are very sharp, right? Very defined, very, at times, very defensive almost. And I think, Nate, you pointed out, when she goes to reach for him, he blocks it and moves away, right? So you get this defensive posture in this dance. The movements are real calculated, and even when they meet up with one another, if you noticed, they met up in a very rigid manner, right? Anybody notice that part of that? They meet up in a really rigid manner. And it's almost like they're navigating this tension and this, I don't know, this impending fight that is happening there between them, or what is to come in this matador's battle. You kind of get this, it feels tense in this. You could even, did you notice even the expressions on their faces? I mean, even when they approached each other, it was, right? They kind of did that. And Dave's like, don't do this anymore. Don't do this to yourself. You're on the internet right now. We still want our pastor to be respected. It's all going out the door today. I'm just saying right now. But why did I start with that one? Because honestly, a lot of the marriages that I have the opportunity to step into remind me of the Paso Doble. And think about your own marriage at times in your lives when maybe you've been in a season where there's this tension, where every time you walk in the door at the end of the day, both of you walk in the door and you're like, Jason, don't you lie. I know you do this dance. But there's this, you're like your movements, the way you carry yourself, it's defensive, it's sharp, it's calculated. It's almost like you're trying to navigate the impending tension that exists between you. Like it's rigid, even when you come close. Did you notice one of the things that they'll ding people on in the Paso Doble when they're sort of rating them is how straight and tight their arms are. Like you got to keep them at a distance, and you're locked in, And how many times, even when we've gone to hug each other, it's not like it's kind of like, right? Because we're not there. There's a tension that exists there. There's a fight that's happening there that we're trying to navigate. And I feel like the Paso Doble is a dance where vulnerability is not valued, right? There's a formality and a rigidness to that dance. Paso Doble means that vulnerability is not valued. That's what I want us to hear from that dance, is that in how many of our marriages are we doing the Paso Doble because vulnerability is not valued? Then in the second dance, the rumba, there's this smoothness to that dance. And I can't remember who said it, but there's almost like this loss of boundary, like this, the worlds just collide and melt into each other. I heard sensual, I heard sexy, I see intimacy, right? There's this melting, there's this eagerness to be close to one another. They're not running from one another, they're pulling each other tight. And even their facial expressions aren't armed with that sense of tension, but have loosened by that sense of desire or want. There is, you can even see it, there's a vulnerability in the dance moves, the way in which they come together and the way in which they glide together. In what I see in the rumba, I see that vulnerability, intimacy is valued. I don't see that in a lot of marriages. I see a lot of Paso Doble, where vulnerability is not valued and we stand rigid. I don't see a lot of rumba. And guys, can I cue you in a little bit here? A lot of us guys have a tendency to live by the Paso Doble and then want to click into the rumba whenever it's convenient for us. Or we go from Paso Doble to being ready for rumba in about 15 minutes. And then we get really discouraged when the wife doesn't want to dance the rumba because we've been doing the Paso Doble. And she's like, I'm not even at the rumba, and don't you even think about lambada, right? It's that idea I'm not going there because and for guys, we can click down from the tension pretty quick, especially when we want something. And then we're super frustrated when that is not reciprocated. And it may be that it's not just the moment that we desire, it may be the lack of intimacy and vulnerability that was present the half an hour, 2 hours, 2 days, for some of us 2 weeks leading up to that desired moment. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point where too many of us are dancing the Paso Doble in our relationships? Well, I think that can be answered for us by going biblical. I think by just going back to the beginning of the book, back to the book of Genesis, we can begin to get a sense of what God's intended desire for our relationship was and where it went wrong. So in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we get these compelling stories of creation. In Genesis 1, you get this beautiful story of this God who's got this big, booming, cosmic voice who brings all things out of nothing, who speaks it, says, let it be, and it is, and not only is it, but it is good, and it's right, and it's true, and it's beautiful. And then God says, let us make them in our own image, man and woman, together they reflect us. In chapter 2, in this creation story of chapter 2, you have this God who's not only a God who has this big booming voice, but a God who gets down, plays in the dirt, and crafts the human, ha-adam, the human. Sometimes translated in your Bibles, the man, but it's probably more like the human, right? Crafts and creates the human out of adamah, out of the dust. And he's fragile. And really, even though he looks like he's something, he's not something, not until God tips back his head, breathes into his nostrils, and breathes the breath of life. Now, he's not only fragile, but he's needy. And this is the only time that we get in Genesis 1 and 2, something's not right. Because every other time it's like, it's good, it's very good. And then God makes man in his fragility and his neediness. And then he looks at the human and says, yeah, something missing. So he says, I need to make a helpmate for him. He tries with the animals, and none of the animals work. And so he causes the Ha-Adam, the human, to fall in a deep sleep. And then out of the side of the human, God creates the Ishishah, the female. And in the Hebrew, we miss this in our text, but the language actually changes. It goes from Ha-Adam at this point to Ish and Ishishah, almost as if to say that at the point that something was taken from the side of the human, that isn't the same anymore. Now you've got male and you've got female. As an Etzer, I love this language of an Etzer, helpmate. The one who walks behind me and picks up my socks and my shoes when I leave them on the floor and takes care of my dirty work in the house. That's what an Etzer does. No, it's not, right? Some of you ladies like, what? You better change this real quick. I don't care if you are on video. We'll come after you and we'll be justified in doing it. No, this idea of Etzer, to be a helpmate, is not one who walks behind, but one who walks alongside. To have an Etzer is one who shares the whole of life together. And there is in this text, and I love this, a loss of boundary between the two. From the bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh are you. It's almost like we exist almost as if we're constantly blending our lives into each other. That the boundary markers that so often define our individuality, that when we're caught up in this marital relationship, this beautiful relationship given to us in Genesis, like those things are sort of subordinated to this beauty of intimacy as we begin to step into each other. And then one of my favorite passages in all of the Bible, the man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. That's a good verse right there, right? Original intent. They're there in the garden. They're sharing in this intimacy, and the Bible says they're naked, and they felt no shame. Now, when you read nakedness in the Hebrew text, when Hebrews speak of naked, they speak of vulnerability. They're open, they're out there. There's nothing getting in the way. There's another really odd story about 10 chapters later when Noah gets really drunk and falls asleep in his tent naked, and his one boy comes in and starts mocking and ridiculing him. The offense is there that there he lay in all of his vulnerability, and he was mocked for it, right? So for the Jews, they sort of, when they speak of nakedness, they speak of this grand vulnerability. And the perfect condition of the garden was that we were together, and there was intimacy, and we were locked arm in arm, and we were sharing life, and we were vulnerable, and we were naked, and we danced naked together in the garden. That's the picture of marriage. That's a beautiful picture. What is lacking in that picture of marriage in Genesis 2? Things like, who's in charge? Who's wearing the pants? Who needs to serve who? Who's submitting to who? Have you noticed that's absent in God's beautiful intent for the relationship in Genesis 2? All of those things that we spend so much time trying to figure out, it's not there in the text. When that shows up is in the next chapter. And what happens in that chapter, now you got to understand, to this point, the whole of creation was living in harmonious relationship. We were in harmonious relationship with God, with the world in which we live, the animals that and one another. There was a harmony in all of our relationships. But at the point that humanity opts for selfish ambition and pride, things begin to unravel. Can you imagine that? Can you remember early on in your marriage or your relationship when you were courting each other, and it was always about the other one? Right? And you're like, this is the best guy ever. He's only ever thinking about me. And then when that changed, and then he started thinking about him, and you're like, what happened? You remember you thought about me. And like pride and selfish ambition begin to creep in. And what happens to relationships when that happens? They begin to unravel, don't they? And so there's this sense that in the garden, there's this temptation, there's deceit, and deceit always sets the stage for disobedience. Just know that. Deceit always sets the stage for disobedience. And there's this slithering serpent, and he calls into question God's command, stay away from that certain tree. And God knows that if you go for that tree, you don't have to be limited anymore. You can be your own person. You can assert yourself. You can be your own God. You can do your own thing. And at the point that they reach for that fruit, and I say they, because they reached for the fruit, right? And at the point that they reach for the fruit in this story, and they take a bite, something goes drastically wrong. What goes wrong? Somebody tell me. What goes wrong in this story when they reach for the fruit? What happens? First thing they notice. Yeah, they're naked. First thing that they notice is that they're naked. The moment that they allow selfish ambition and their own prideful desires get in the way, the first thing that they recognize is, oh, I'm vulnerable. Now, what's their response to their vulnerability? Yeah, they covered up. They run and they go cover, right? So think about this. The moment that pride settles into a relationship and we take a bite of it, we recognize I am vulnerable, and that is not the preferred condition. So what is our preferred condition when we find out we're vulnerable? We cover it up, right? We don't want anyone to see what's going on there. I'm naked. I got to do something about that. And then the story talks about God shows up in the cool of the day, and they begin to realize God's going to hang out with us, and we've messed up. So they go and they hide, right? Because that's the next piece of where that desire to cover up drives us, as we start hiding from those relationships that should have been the most close to us. And even in the story, when we're given an opportunity to out ourselves, this is the beauty of this story. God doesn't come in condemning voice. God comes with invitation. He shows up. There's still a redemptive moment in this story. Still a moment where things could have turned and twisted and gone another way. When God says, hey, where are you? And Adam comes out and goes, we were hiding because we were naked. And God says, who told you were naked? This is the moment of redemption. This is the moment when vulnerability could have still been the story. This is the moment when Adam could have said, you know what, God, here's my fig leaf. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this any longer. I messed up, but I'm outing myself, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to heal the relationship. That's not what the story does it? What's his response? Yeah, he's like, I know, right? Because, I mean, I don't point any fingers, but that woman you gave me, anybody ever notice where he's double deflecting? He's not just blaming the woman. Did you ever catch that? He's blaming God. I know there's not one of us in here in any of our relationships that have ever woken up at night and going, that man you gave me, what were you thinking, God? Right? None of us have ever done that. Right? So there's this double deflection from Adam where, like, this woman you gave me, God, it's your fault, it's her fault, it's not my fault. I was just an innocent bystander. And then all of a sudden, what's she do? She deflects that serpent. And in that moment, we move to the paso doble stance. Right? That's the posture of the story at this point. And God begins to say, okay, as a result of that, the harmony and the beauty of the music that was in the garden has created great dissonance now. And now all of those harmonious relationships begin to unravel. He says, first between you and the earth. You're going to work it with the sweat of your brow, and it's going to produce thorns. Then with the animals. You're just going to try to bite at your heel. You're going to strike it with your heel. And then with each other. And God says this, man, you're going to rule over her. And then her desire will be for him. And now, all of a sudden, this beauty of the rumba in the garden becomes the tension and the posturing and the rigidness of the paso doble. And all of a sudden, everything that made that relationship beautiful, the intimacy, the nakedness, the extreme vulnerability, the sharing of life with one another as Etzer, it all comes unraveled. And the great, grand, wonderful result is that we step into relations now calculating how do we gain the advantage, calculating how do we preserve our lack of vulnerability, calculating who has the authority, who gets to call the shots in the home. We calculate, and so we move through our homes with a rigidness, constantly calculating about how are we going to navigate this tension between us. And there's a lot of barriers that begin to move into our lives as a result of this story, and as a result of the ways in which we reenact this story over and over in our marriages. Talk to me about, what do you think some of the barriers to vulnerability become in our lives, in our relationships with one another? What are some of the barriers to vulnerability? Yes, good. So when you step out in that risk, and then all of a sudden that risk is tread upon, and someone takes advantage of that vulnerability. Very good, awesome. Fear, yeah. Like what are we afraid of? Yeah, being mocked. That's right. Absolutely. What else? What else becomes a barrier? What becomes a barrier in your relationship to the vulnerability that is requisite for a healthy, thriving, faithful relationship? Status, okay. Who's in charge? Who's got the power structure in the family, right? Good. Yeah, good. Weakness. Oh, what weakness? I ain't gonna show you my weakness. Right? I'm gonna do the best thing I can to avoid showing my weakness, right? That's good. What else? Keeping the peace even when it's a false peace. Yeah, even if we can just ease the situation, back away, never resolve the issue, but the failure to resolve the thing that keeps causing the unraveling continues to compound week after week, month after month, and year after year. If you never resolve the thing that has created the tension, that has created the paso doble stance, you'll never move into a full rumba. It's good. What else? Anything else you can think of? Lack of communication, yeah. Yeah, because the moment we move into that defensive posture, the less apt we are to do the hard work of communicating well with one another, right? Because every word is calculated, right? Good. Well, anything else? Yeah, Debbie. Unforgiveness, yeah. Good thing none of us in here deal with that. That's so good. Yeah, no, right? So that is a huge one, isn't it? Unforgiveness. Come on now. How do you think Eve felt when Adam outed her to God? Right? Like, she was like, what? She's talking, you were right there. You saw me. You could have said something. And if you don't think she harbored that a little bit, right? And let's just face it. That unforgiveness that probably was pent up in their lives probably was passed down to their kids. Did you notice that in the story? Their kids take that sense of unforgiveness and pride, domination and control from mom and dad, and then it works out really poorly in the next chapter, right? If you haven't read the next chapter, it's Cain and Abel. There's death, bloody, nasty. You can go back and read it. Yeah. And Debbie, can I change a word there? Because where I want us to get to is not shooting for perfect, but beautiful. Okay? Is I think our relationship, and that's what happens, what we talked about last week. When that perfection comes crashing down, that's when we start to go, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. So then we have to move to the sense to how do we be faithful in that, and how can our faithfulness then become beautiful again? That's why I like the image of dancing. Because what I love about the rumba is it's beautiful. And it wasn't perfect. I don't know if you noticed, the guy was still kind of, he wasn't the best dancer. Like some of you are like, he's better than I was. I mean, he's better than me too. I'm not being critical. But I'm saying when you look at it, there was still some movements that weren't altogether perfect. But it was beautiful. And so that's, how do we get there, right? So flip your page on the backside here, and I want to kind of go through a list of some of the things that I think, some of the barriers to vulnerability. And I want you to pay attention to these, because at some point tonight we're going to talk about these within our couples, right? And so we're going to spend some time working through these. So the first one is, and I think this is huge, what drives a person to cover up and hide? It's very, very easy. Shame. Shame. It has been my experience as a pastor that shame affects a larger portion of the people that I pastor than even realize are being affected by it. Shame is this sort of internalized sense of worthlessness. It's this sense that I am no good, or I'm at least not good enough, right? We sort of carry that around with us. Shame does that to us. It's what happens when we realize that we're naked and we don't like it. We don't like what we see when we stand there vulnerably before even the people that are the most closest to us. It's often the result of repetitive treatments by someone else in our life that then becomes the feedback loop that plays on in our minds. What I mean by that is, when you have consistently had your sense of self-worth called into question, when you have consistently been devalued, when you have consistently been disrespected, when you have consistently been told that you don't measure up, you're not good enough, when your first marriage was caught up in this brutal cycle of constantly feeling like you would never measure up and be good enough, what happens is our brains create their own feedback loop. And those words that are spoken, we don't even need the person there anymore, right? Have you ever noticed that about shame? We don't even need the person around us anymore, because we've gone ahead and translated their voice into our voice, and now it's playing in the back of our head all the time. Shame is what's constantly telling us, I don't measure up, I'm not good enough, I'll never be good enough. And what I find a lot is that when you're dealing with shame, it leads us to a false self. And this false self is not who you are really, but who you try to be. And that false self is usually worked out in two different ways. Number one is escape. So when I live in shame, I'm constantly trying to escape how I feel about myself. And we all can develop escape mechanisms. I find that a lot of people that drink too much are really trying to escape the shame that's been a part of their story. People who live in the shame, they may try to escape into another relationship. They may try to escape all of their problems through overspending. Any of those things can be the result of shame. We're escaping from what we feel. I have met a number of people that they feel badly about themselves, so their escape is, I'm going to surround myself with as much stuff or nicest stuff, even if it puts me perilously in debt, in order to demonstrate like there's something worth looking at on the outside. It's like we wear this sense of worthlessness on our sleeves, or we seek validation. And how do we seek validation? We seek validation in so many different unhealthy ways. We seek validation from the opposite sex. If we're not getting it from home, or we're not living in vulnerability with our spouse, and that validation is not something that I can trust, I will seek that validation from someone else. And it makes us dangerously susceptible to when someone does take notice and begin to validate us even in a little bit. Okay? That's something that we have to be aware of. Shame can set us up for the kind of vulnerability that's not the kind of vulnerability we're looking for. It's the vulnerability that says, if someone affirms me, I'm most prone to sort of give them a little bit more so that I can continue to receive that validation because it feels so good. So shame drives us to either escape or validation. Then there's guilt, okay? And I think this can be a boundary. Now, I don't want to say all guilt's bad, because guilt on the backside of a mistake that leads one to remorse and repentance ultimately leads us to transformation. So when we mess up in our relationship, guilt is a valid response. Like the other day, my wife, God bless her, drove all the way to Olivet to have lunch with her son. She comes in my office, and I was a goober. I'm out myself. I'm out myself. I'm not going to tell what's about. So she... This is so, I don't know why I brought this up. No, I'll tell him. I'll tell him. So she dressed up. She had come to have lunch with her son, popped in my office, and she was wearing a fanny pack. She's a nice fanny pack. And I laughed. I said, honey, you dressed up. Why are you wearing a fanny pack? She's like, because it's convenient. I said, but it's a fanny pack. That's a weird looking thing for that. I just got hooked on the fanny pack for some reason. And she's just standing there looking at me. And then she leaves, and I was like, you are an idiot. So I immediately got on my phone. I'm sorry. There was a sense of guilt that I felt after giving her a hard time about her fanny pack, which produced a sense of remorse, which ultimately led to repentance, which had me groveling for forgiveness. And thankfully, she was a gift of grace. Aww. I don't know. What do you do? Yes, you do point out the fanny packs wherever we are. So, what's that? Britt, I know. I should have never brought this up. But here's the deal, and here's what I know about our marriage. Had I moved on, had I just forgotten that? Had I not responded to the way the Spirit, I'm going to tell you, the Spirit got all over me for that. It's silly as it seems. Had I not responded, that would have been harbored. Somewhere that would have come out. Somewhere. And I would have come home wanting to rumba, and I would have met a Paso Doble. Right? And I'd have been like, why are we not rumbaing? And she's like, right? So there's this sense that guilt in of itself is not a bad thing, but guilt internalized, or guilt when it becomes this constant repetitive theme, it's all my fault, often means we bear too much responsibility for everything. This is the false piece. Sometimes in our relationships, when you're dealing with someone who's not really self-aware or is not willing to come to terms with their own junk, it feels easier to accept all the responsibility on my shoulders than to have to deal with the conflict of having to really deal with what's going on. That's the kind of, and what happens is, and some of you grew up in situations like that. Some of you have carried that into your marriage. Some of you grew up feeling like everything was your fault, and now you've taken that and you just bear all of the responsibility for it. Lacks a strong sense of self-awareness, and it fails to see that marriage is a dance. Marriage is a dance in which you've got two partners involved. Now, there are times when we have to repent of the mistake we make, but a lot of times the tension that exists in our relationship, it's not just driven by one person. We have to learn how to be able to take responsibility for our parts. right? If we're going to seek healing, I've got to be able to own, this is the stuff that I keep doing wrong. But I have to trust that God's at work in my spouse, revealing the stuff that maybe together we need to work on. And so there's a sense that we have to be careful that guilt can drive that wedge. Without honest accountability, there is never healing, which means false peace will not last long. I have found that false peace generally drives a wedge and creates distance in a relationship. That's when we move back to where we talked about last week, where we're just surviving, we're not thriving. And so we've got to be careful with that. The third one, blame. Blame is an incredible barrier to vulnerability, because blame says that you can't be trusted. Because I'm afraid that any point at which I have opened myself up, that's coming back to me. I was in a work situation one time, and I had trusted the group that I was working with, and so I was making myself vulnerable in that setting. And some of you know exactly how this kind of thing happens, making myself vulnerable in that setting. And I was saying, okay, this is something that I do wrong, and I'm working on it. Then I had to call one of the people that I was working with on the carpet for something that they did, and immediately that came back at me. Well, that's because you don't do that. And I was like, hold up, wait a minute, what just happened there? No, what I'm correcting you on has nothing to do with what I share. But in their minds, they translated my vulnerability into a reason to blame me for what they were doing wrong. And that blame means that I can't trust you with my vulnerability. You're not trustworthy with my vulnerability. And so if you're going to turn around and use that in some way against me, I can't step out and be open and vulnerable with you. So we've got shame, we've got guilt, we've got blame. The fourth one is fear. I think this one drives a lot of the conversation, and I think, Becky, you talked about this sense of fear of being known. How many of us have this sense about ourselves that if someone really knew what I felt about myself or what I thought, the thoughts that went through my head, they would want nothing to do with me? I think a lot of us have that, don't we? We have that moment where we're like, if I really let my spouse see who I was, there's no way that they would want to be with me. And so this fear of being outed, this fear of revealing those things that are so deep within us that we don't even like. I mean, if we don't even like them, how can we entrust that to someone else? Being exposed usually allows people to see things that maybe we don't want them to see. Fear of coming to terms with oneself and not liking what is found. That's scary, when you lead people into self-awareness and they come to realize, oh, I got issues. Sometimes we'd rather bury our head in the sand and go, I'm good. But can I say this? We're generally not as good as we think we are, but we're almost always not as bad as we think we are. So we're somewhere, like self-awareness, laying somewhere in between. Self-awareness is this ability to be able to say, there's some things I got going on here that I got to work on, but then there's some other things that I think they're valuable, and I bring them to the table. Self-awareness does that. But fear will drive you to the point where you don't want to name any of that. Our insecurities keep us from being honest about and with ourselves. I think our insecurities drive a great wedge in our relationships. And that insecurity, I'll tell you where an insecurity came from in our early years of our relationship. Is I struggled in our early years. I was in the military. I was graduating college, and I made our first paycheck when I got out of college into the military was $1,100 for the month. That was it, $1,100, and I was $1,100 for the next, year and a half, and then I moved up to a roaring $1,500. It was awesome, right? That $400 paycheck increase, that was great. I lived in a constant state of insecurity that I wasn't taking care of her. So here's what happened. She'd walk into the house with a catalog or a magazine, and she'd say, hey, Jeff, I really like this dress. Why do you want that dress? Don't you have enough dresses? Why are you going to tell me about a dress? How do you think we're going to afford a dress? And all of a sudden, she'd be like, walking away. She was just telling me she liked the dress. But I didn't receive that she was just telling me she liked the dress. In my mind is that she wanted me to buy the dress, and I didn't have the money to buy the dress because I didn't have any money, which really pointed back to the fact that I was insecure. And my insecurity drove that argument, which then ultimately shut her up so she wouldn't tell me things, because I don't want to create an argument. How are you going to translate every time I tell you I like something? I mean, it was so bad at one point, we see a car driving down the street. She's like, man, I like that car. What's wrong with our car? Something wrong with our car? She's like, I just like the color, right? But my insecurities drove me into that spot. So those insecurities, I think, play a huge role in the divisions that we experience. Domination. Guys, I know what Paul says. In the New Testament, wives, submit to your husbands. Let's pray in young. Careful how you read that text. And I shared this with you a couple months ago. When it says, wives, submit to your husbands, you ought to read the part that says, husbands, you ought to treat your wives like Christ treated the church. You know how Jesus exerted his leadership in the home? He took off his towel, got a basin, and washed his disciples' feet. Leadership happens through servanthood. That's what that model looks like. And so I hear guys come into my office, and they'll sit down, and I don't mean to pick on guys, and I'll come to you ladies here in a minute, only really gingerly. So I'll have guys say, Bible tells me man should rule over the woman. I'll look at them and I'll say, that was Genesis 3, man. That was Genesis 3. That was post-fall. I mean, if we're going to do this right, don't we want to go to Genesis 2, which is pre-fall? Don't we want to go back to the rumba? Why are you settling for the paso doble? Why are you trying to exert your dominance over this situation? And why is it that we have to constantly figure out who's wearing the pants in the family? I don't see that in Genesis 2. They didn't have any pants, so no one could wear them. Just think about how many less arguments you get into if you just stop wearing pants around the house. You wouldn't even be arguing about who's wearing them. Be rumbling. Just saying. I told you we'd be talking about this stuff. But what I'm saying there is if we're going to do this well, we shouldn't settle for domination. We should be seeking teamwork. We should be seeking mutuality. We should be seeking the reciprocal behavior of serving one another, right? That's the biblical model. But domination too often drives the wedge. Then there's this issue of what I call perverted desire. And this is actually spoken over the woman. So, man, you should rule over the woman. Your desire will be for your husband. Now, we miss the nuance of this statement because we don't understand the Hebraic culture that this comes out of. And really, David is a great example of this. David and his terrible relation with Michal was just terrible marriage. Saul's daughter, terrible marriage. He denied her sex, which means this. Her desire was for him, but not for him. Her desire was for him because only through him could she become pregnant, have a male child, and have an identity. Her identity was wrapped up in him, okay? So it's not just desire, it's a perverted desire that says my identity is somehow wrapped up in our dysfunctional relationship. Another good word for that, codependency. That's another great word that will break down the barriers of vulnerability is that when my desires are wrapped up in our dysfunctional behaviors and my identity is based upon sort of what I get from you or what I can give you versus the way we stand together and shared life together, that's when things begin to break down. And the last one is, and I'm just going to say this one, is narcissism. And I'm going to say that, so narcissism is a real diagnosable mental illness, okay? Or emotional behavioral illness. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's a diagnosable thing. And that's sort of the extreme form of a world that is constantly shaped where I stand at the center of my own universe. Everybody is only and ever a visitor to it or a servant to me. But narcissism plays out in our relationships in very real ways. In subtle ways, like we never have money for the thing that he wants or she wants because we only ever have money for the thing that I want, right? So we don't mind telling the other person like, no, you can, because this is really about me at the end of the day. Narcissism is this sense of it's this sense of believing that I'm never in the wrong, like I'm always in the right, and that I'm going to continually exert myself over the person, diminishing that other person, making sure they know their place. And I think that bleeds into our relationships, or can. Think about the ways in which some of these things affect the vulnerability in our relationships. Think about shame. Think about how in what we don't even realize to be intentional ways, we reaffirm shame. So our spouse is going through a difficult time. They lost their job. They haven't had much luck. They're sitting on the couch when you come home from work. And you walk through the living room, and they're already living in the shame of feeling like they're not doing enough. And you just happen to walk through the house and go, what'd you do today? And they don't give you a good answer, so you go, man, you're so lazy. And then you walk through the house. You've just given them something else to replay. Ooh. Just reinforce that. What would be the difference? The difference. Knowing what they're dealing with. If you stopped and said, how's your day? Not good? And you went down and you sat next to them and you grabbed their hand and you said, I want you to know I believe in you. And I know this season is going to end someday. And we're going to come through this better and stronger. But I believe in you. How might that little encounter transform a situation in which that person felt shame? How might that one little affirmation that you speak into the person's life? So how we live and act and talk and share life together can reinforce some of those barriers. Last thing I want to do before we divide up is I want to say, how do we move away from Paso Doble and into the rumba? And it's this word here, be brave. Because vulnerability is always an act of courage, okay? So we've got to be brave. And I got you a little acronym there. So when we're wanting to move towards vulnerability, there's some things that I want us to keep in mind. First, and I think it's intentionality. I don't think vulnerability just happens, especially on the front end. If you have found yourself in your relationship with a lack of vulnerability, there is an intentionality that has to go back into it in order to recover it. I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, this is one of the things that my wife and I discovered beautifully through the counseling we've been doing for the last 5 months. I always felt like we talked, but I don't think we ever really understood how to be intentional with vulnerability. So one of the things that we've become to realize is you have to begin by naming the need. Vulnerability is not a fly-by conversation. So to be vulnerable with your spouse often means you have to sit down and say to them, can I say a few things to you? I need to get some things off my chest, or I need to talk with you. Because if they're going 100 miles per hour in another direction, and you try to lob out there a bit of vulnerability, and it's not returned back to you, that's going to make you feel like they didn't really want to hear it. When they didn't know it was coming at them. That wasn't even fair, right? They didn't even, they're going, like, I got to go to the grocery store, I got to pay bills, I got to do all these things, and you did what? And it, like, okay, can we talk about this later? And then what do? Can we talk about this later? What's our response? Never mind. We just shut down. But what if we just said to the person, walking through, hey, I know you got a lot going on right now. I know you got a lot on your mind. At some point in the next 12 hours, can you and I have a conversation? I need to share something. Honey, sure, let me run to the store. We'll come back, we'll cook together, put this stuff away, and then let's sit down and have a conversation. How do you be intentional about this space? So begin by naming the need. E, expect and name the feelings of doubt and deceit, okay? What I mean by that is the minute you take the leap into vulnerability and say, I want to have a talk, all of a sudden, every bit of those insecurities that you just mustered in your head are going to begin flying off the handle in your head, right? Like, you shouldn't share that with her. You know what happened last time. This is not going to go well. They're not really going to pay attention. They don't really care. And you just got, you know what I think? You sit down and say, hey, honey, we're going to talk, but I need to tell you what I'm doing. Because this is what I felt. And that gives them a chance to affirm that, yeah, those were lies. Those were lies going on in the back of your head. Because I'm here and I care about you and I want to be here with you. So you begin with naming a need. You expect and name feelings of doubt and deceit. Be aware of tone and body language, okay? When you are doing vulnerability with one another, don't look disinterested. Don't be like, and don't keep doing this. Right? You've got to be intentional. What is your posture? What is your, and when that person wants to be vulnerable, this look is never helpful. That's just not helpful. So the person takes the leap to share. Here's something I got, and you're like, right? Practice that in the mirror, not doing that. Right? Go. So how do you not? And some of us do not hold our cards close to us at all. Every time we interact, it's like laying all of our cards out on the table. So we've got to learn how to be careful with our tone and our body language. R, respect one another's boundaries. Meaning this, when you are entering into vulnerability, that person is probably going to be testing the waters at first. Don't push too hard too quick, okay? So don't think that you're going to go from 0 to 100 in 15 minutes. If you have not been doing vulnerability well in your relationship, it's going to take some time. So when that person says, that's all I can do right now, respect that boundary. Don't keep pushing. Don't push past it, because if you do, then you could trigger another set of occurrences that won't be helpful or healthy. A, ask meaningful questions. How do you ask? So when the person is sharing, are you going to be able to ask meaningful questions about it? Not just yes or no's, not just to end the conversation. So when the person sits with you and says, I got to tell you, I'm not a good place in my work right now. And I feel like everything that I'm doing is going wrong. Instead of just going, what's wrong with you? Or, what are you doing wrong? It's not a meaningful question. Instead, you ask something like, what do you feel like has changed in your life that is making you feel that way? What situations or relationships are going on at work that are calling you to question your worth and your value? Ask meaningful questions, the kind of questions that signify that you are paying attention and that you really do care. V, value what is shared. I think one of the most important things you could do in that moment, especially at the end of the sharing, is say, thank you for trusting me with that today. And I know you're married. You should be able to trust. But there is something about at the close of a conversation like that, when that person looks at you and says, thank you for trusting me that much. And I want you to know that I value everything that you have shared with me. And I think we probably need to talk about this again. So let's give it a day or two, and let's come back to it. And then the last E is exit with a hug and a kiss. There is something about, I'm just going to tell you, when you are, so one of the things that my wife and I do when we do our counseling, we always do lunch afterwards. Because we share a lot in our counseling. And the last thing I want to do is just get up, go on, move on, and be done. So we go to lunch after our counseling so that we can sit across from one another and look at each other and smile at one another, because we just went through some stuff in there. And there's something about just not going, and then the other person goes, all right, peace, I'm out. Right? There's something about the tenderness of taking a hand and you grab hold of them and you hug them and you kiss them and you say, I love you and I'm here with you. Because vulnerability needs to know that they're not being given up on. That they're going to be there, you're going to be there, and that you're still in it together. So you got to be brave. All right. So here's what I want us to do. We got 15 more minutes. We're going to do our couples things again. Okay, so again, if you're sitting sideways, make sure you're holding hands. Preferred if you can find a seat where you can move to each other, knees against one another, holding hands, looking into each other's eyes. First thing you're gonna name, and I think this is always so important. Last week, what do I value? This week, I want you to look at your spouse, and I want you to tell them what there's one strength that they bring into your marriage. I want you to name at least one strength. And I want you to say, this is what you bring to our relationship. And I am thankful. Our relationship would not be the same if you were not bringing that to it. And then you each share that. Then I want you to ask the question, out of this list that I shared, shame, guilt, blame, fear, domination, perverted desire, narcissism, I want you to name which is the one that we feel probably struck the most chord with us today. That, and you don't even, at this point in 15 minutes, you probably don't even have to get into the full reasons why. Some of you may be able to talk about that a little bit, but just being able to name, like, you know, and don't just name it for your spouse, try to name it for yourself. Let your spouse name it for themselves, okay? It's really kind of dangerous when you look at your spouse and say, I think you deal with shame. Because all of a sudden they went, and you just added to it. So instead, you have to name it for yourself. Like own what you feel, and then let them speak for themselves. And then answer the question, what is one step that we're going to take this week that we can start working through that, okay? All right, so strength. Which of this list are we gonna struggle with? Are we struggling with? And then what is one step that we can take together? All right, we've got about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, so let's break up and have our conversations with our spouses. Another couple minutes. All right, we're going to wrap things up here tonight, and hopefully these conversations will continue even past our time together tonight, and maybe some of us need to go home and have another set of conversations. That's right. So your assignment is to go home and dance naked. Hey, yeah, that's right. Everybody's, right, like church. Church is good. Somebody just said, you want to babysit? So, hey, we're going to be back here next week. And next week, we're going to take one step further. Okay, so we've set the stage of we're looking for faithful, not perfection, right? This is first week. Second week, we talked about this is going to require vulnerability. Third week is now that we've established this is going to require vulnerability, we're going to look at what's called above the line, below the line stuff. And a lot of our tension, conflict, struggle that we deal with is above the line. Above the line is what is immediately observable and experiential. So it's how we talk to each other, the behaviors, the actions. Too little of our marriages is shaped by having the kinds of conversations where we go below the line and asking questions about values, about ambitions, about aspirations, those types of things.